Super profundo on the early eve of your day. Thanks for joining me on Out of the Cave, where we reimagine what society can be if given a fresh start. I'm your host, JP Taxman, a designer, thinker, and realist, searching for the right questions to get the right answers to create a society that is better and not perfect. How valuable do you think education is to a society? In this episode, we chat with Jesse and Sean about what an ideal education system might look like and how we could put more value on choosing to be a teacher as a profession. Jesse Stommel is Executive Director of the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies at University of Mary Washington. He is also co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, an open access journal of learning, teaching, and technology. He has a PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder, where I grew up going to football games. My dad actually graduated from there as well. But he is a documentary filmmaker and teaches courses about pedagogy, film, and new media. Sean Morris, on the other hand, is a digital teacher and pedagogue with experience especially in instructional design, networked learning, digital composition and publishing, collaboration, and editing. His work in the field of critical digital pedagogy and critical instructional design is founded in the philosophy of Paulo Freire. He is currently the Director of Digital Learning at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia, and also the Director of the Digital Pedagogy Lab, an experimental, exploratory professional development gathering for a global digital pedagogy community. Yeah, I know this again, but I'm going to keep saying it until a couple people donate. And then I'll probably keep saying it. But if you enjoyed the episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could share this episode with at least one person. And if you're really feeling generous, I'd really appreciate it if you hopped on over to Patreon and supported me at patreon.com/outofthecave. And with all the links, they will be in the show notes, so you can just click it and go instead of having to type it in. I also have some really cool rewards at Patreon that you can check out. One is really awesome. I'm really excited to do it and just hope some people donate, where you get to be a character and I use your name in a story show that will be about the society actually coming to life. So hop on over there and be one of the first to donate, and you'll get to be on it probably forever. And now let's take our 16th step out of the cave with Jesse Stommel and Sean Morris. Alrighty. So, I typically start out the podcast. I sent you the thing beforehand, but I just kind of like to get us in the frame of mind of the discussion, because sometimes it's hard to get out of fixing what we're in instead of trying to create something new. So I kind of just do a preface to get us in the frame of mind, and then we'll just jump right into some questions.
Great.
Cool. So let's imagine that we're building a seastead, which is a floating city in the middle of the ocean. Our goal is to create an optimized society fresh from start, meaning we'll rethink the entire fabric of society, ranging from the culture to the values and norms to economic structures, educational systems, government systems, and the urban development landscape. So keep in mind in our discussion that I can provide you with whatever resources necessary within the bounds of physics and what's available on Earth, of course, except for maybe asteroids. You might be able to mine some asteroids if we have to. So, when we're creating this society, what are some of the ways we could set up an education system that teaches kids how important and valuable the people teaching them are?
That's an interesting question. I think actually the first thing that that sort of comes to mind there is that so our philosophy around teaching is that teachers and students are collaborative in a classroom. So I understand where the desire to make sure that teaching is valued in society in general is something important, but keeping in mind that students and teachers are working together in a classroom, and that it's sort of less for Jesse may need to jump in and help me, but it's sort of less about students recognizing the value of teachers and more, I think, society recognizing the value of teachers. And in that way, I think if we can figure out how to help society value teachers, then kids grow up in a society where teachers are valued and when they get into a classroom. But even in that situation, we have to sort of reframe the idea of teaching so that when students show up in a classroom, they're not just going to sit down and listen and absorb, but they're going to be participating in their education.
Yeah, to me, I think the first thing that you do is you teach students how to be teachers. I think something that happens in our culture pretty widely at this point, and beyond our culture, in lots of different cultures around the world, I think that teaching is increasingly being devalued as a both as a skill and also as a kind of labor that we do. And so I think if there's a way to get the students from the very start to be thinking about themselves as teachers and thinking about their role as teachers. So I'm even thinking about my 2-year-old and thinking about at what age, she's 2, at what age does she start to teach me? Mm-hmm. And honestly, she already has. And so finding ways that our relationship is less about me being the mentor of her and finding ways as early as possible to have her being a mentor to me, because that's when I see like the light absolutely come on for her, is not when I'm guiding her through something, but it's like, I mean, she'll come home from school and she'll be showing me how to do something. She's 2 years old, and she'll be showing, no. You can just tell, like, she's not talking through it, but I can just tell she's trying to model behavior for me. And then when I imitate it, that's the thing that really makes that behavior lock for her. It's not when I dictate it to her.
Yeah, it's exciting. Mm-hmm. It gives her, makes her connect more with the information.
There was a conversation that I had once with an education journalist that we both know, Audrey Waters, and it was several years back, and we were sort of doing exactly this exercise of trying to imagine, well, what's going to come. Now that education is changing, we're all going online. We deal with all this new digital stuff. So what's going to come? And a lot of what we came out of that conversation was talking about sort of mentorship and apprenticeship models where basically it's not unlike what Jesse's just talking about, because when you're raising a child to become an adult. You're trying to raise a child so that they will be an independent, confident, capable, productive adult. And when you're teaching students, in some way, you're hoping that they get to a place where they can also then teach others, that they can then transfer those skills out. So it's not really just about like teaching job skills. It's not about teaching certain content. It's actually about teaching, being sort of a behavioral model, being a kind of model of a person who teaches. And so similarly, I think there's a kind of play in this when you talk about setting up a brand new education system. Rethinking everything from the point of are we still going to have colleges? Are we going to have the semester system? Are we going to have grades? Are we going to have all these things which all sort of line up together to make the education system that we have, and that tends to be sort of oppressive for students. They're not really invited into their own education. They're asked to sort of sit there and absorb information and then regurgitate information. And if we're going to change that, like, what does that even look like? Are we looking at semesters? Are we looking at schools? Are we looking at like little educational villages where people are gathering and learning skills together and sharing back and forth? And you see that sort of thing happening on the open web. People sharing stories and sharing experiences and teaching each other. And it doesn't really matter what level of education they have. It matters what sort of experience they bring. So there could be something in that. There could be some sort of new model.
I think what I want is that idea. Something much more akin to the one-room schoolhouses, where by necessity, students were teaching each other, because you would have every grade level in a single classroom in some cases. And so by necessity, the teacher wasn't teaching to everyone simultaneously. The teacher was teaching to different parts of the room at different moments, but then the room was its own kind of life form, breathing, thinking, talking, speaking, engaging, and each part of that room had to be equally engaged in the work of education and the project of education, rather than this idea of just one person standing up at the front and transmitting knowledge to the entire room. So like if we could have a bunch of tents on the island and each one was its own little mini one-room schoolhouse, the little field of tents, one-room schoolhouse tents.
I like it, man. I think that's a big point. You guys hit on some amazing points. Like, I'm so excited about what you're saying because I'm so on board with all of it. Like that's one of the things too. Why is it that you have to segregate people into age groups? Why is that the best way for people to learn? Like, why everyone can learn from everyone at different ages, and older people can teach the younger people. It's so important. And I love that idea too of collaboration and collaborating together with the teacher and with the students and everyone working together to learn and grow as one in essence, right? And kind of become whatever it is that they're going to become, not just like, oh, here, take this information, do whatever you will, and then go on and do whatever with it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that one of the things that I was thinking about before we had this conversation was that it's impossible to separate out, if you're creating a new society, it's impossible to separate just the conversation of education, because you're always talking about the ecosystem that supports education. You're talking about the attitudes of parents as they're sending their kids to school. What is school going to get for them? What do they expect of their students, of their kids? And if you shift this around and all of a sudden you have a little campsite of one-room schoolhouse tents, then all of a sudden what school is, what it's for, when it begins, when it ends, who participates, who leads, etc. All of that.
What was that last thing you said? Yeah. I think you cut out.
I'm sorry. Yeah, all of that is positioned to change. And it has to change from the schoolhouse outward and from outward to the schoolhouse. It can't just be the schoolhouse. We can't reinvent school without also thinking about the rest of society.
At different moments in our history, we've made decisions about school. And at this point, we don't necessarily know where those decisions even came from or what motivated them. Certainly, if I study educational history like I have, I can sort of pinpoint some of those decisions and why we made them. But the bulk of people attending school and even teaching school don't necessarily know why things exist. Things like the A, B, C, D, F grade system. If someone said we all do it, if someone was forced to make an argument for the A, B, C, D, F grade system, I think they'd be hard pressed to do it. I think the argument would be, well, it's what we do. It's what we're used to. It's what students expect. It's what's easy for me because it's what I've always done. There wouldn't necessarily be that germ that launched that into being in the first place. And also, I think your example is a good one. Why did we suddenly put grade levels into different rooms? And certainly an educational historian could say tons about that. And I could probably say a little bit about that. But do people who are working in these classrooms know why that exists? No, it's almost we accept as the status quo, we break people into grade levels. And so I think what we need to do is we need to find ways to be this island every year, start fresh and look around and say, what am I going to do with my classroom? What am I going to do with the educational space? And that isn't to say to knock it all down and start from scratch every time, because we've learned so much and there's so much that is valuable. And we can't just imagine that we could build something better if we just destroy it all. Instead, what we have to do is constantly be learning and constantly be reinventing this thing on the fly, instead of essentially what we're doing in a lot of cases saying is, well, we already have concrete walls, so we certainly can't rearrange this room. Instead of thinking, well, what if we really need to? What should we do? How can we approach that?
Oh man, great analogy. Great points, man. Yeah, because you can move the concrete wall. It's not easy, but you just get a sledgehammer and you break it down and then you rebuild it bigger, right? And I think there's another point I wanted to hit on about how important the education system is. Like, it is, I believe, the core point to an entire society. Like, that's how your people are becoming people. And like you said, it is like that changes the cultures, is how you change the education system. Like, that will form how people become people. And that has to be so well thought through, like we're talking about. And I think that's one of the best ways to do it. Like you're talking about, Jesse, is breaking it down every year and saying, okay, what really worked? And like doing an evaluation. Did this work? Do we like ABC grades? Okay, no, that doesn't seem to be connecting with kids as well. Maybe we just need to kind of do evaluations where they, maybe just evaluate themselves every year or every quarter or semester and look at how they did. And, oh, hey, did that work better? I don't know. Let's check it out. So what are some of the ways we do a horrible job of valuing teachers in American society, and how might we learn from that?
What are some of the ways we do a horrible job of valuing teachers in this American society?
Yeah, I was going to say,
should we start with pay? I mean,
we put our money where our values are. And I think that that's what's happening more than anything else with teachers, is that the work of teaching is being devalued financially. And it's also being devalued in the sense that we're not even just talking about a pay gap, or we're not even just talking about salary compression, or talking about salaries not being high enough with comparison to other disciplines or other fields. We're talking about precarity across education, where full-time employment is increasingly impossible for educators. I was just reading a statistic about teachers in Denver who just went on strike today, I think. I haven't followed the news throughout the rest of the day, but something I was reading was talking about how the average teacher in this system has to have a roommate, has to work multiple jobs, cannot support even themselves, much less a family, on the wages of a school teacher in the Denver public school system. And if you think about college, and you think about 70% of the workforce in college, the faculty workforce is are contingent laborers in the U.S., which means that they don't have full-time jobs, which means they don't have health insurance, which means if they have a major health crisis, essentially they won't have the insurance to cover, to keep themselves healthy, to keep themselves able to even do the work. So, I mean, if we talk about how we evaluate teachers, that's an evaluation. That's a very clear evaluation, a very clear message that's sent to teachers all over the country and also all over the world, that we don't value the work of teaching.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also we also have to recognize the ways in which pedagogy and the work of teaching is handed over to policymakers, is handed over to people who look at the product of education as opposed to the process of education. Are we graduating enough students? Are we competitive in the global market? And all of a sudden, education serves as a tool towards something that policymakers and politicians are interested in, but have very little to do with the students, have even less to do with the teachers. Mm-hmm. Those same teachers in Denver, and actually K-12 teachers all over the country, are under pressure to create to get students. Basically, they have to teach the test. They have to get students to pass certain tests all along the way. They have to achieve a certain kind of level of quality in the education, or they may lose funding, or they may not. Their school may close. We've seen this sort of thing happen. And that's not valuing the process of education. That's valuing the product of education, the sort of the end goal of education, which is in the mind of leaders. Mm-hmm. And when those folks decide, okay, here's what pedagogy should look like. Here are the standards we should. Sorry, go ahead.
Can you define what pedagogy is? Because I think a lot of people might not know that term.
Sure. Pedagogy, I mean, you can define it a number of different ways, but I guess how I'm using it is in terms of both your classroom practice, how you plan even a single day, but also your whole year, if you're K-12, and then also just how you approach teaching. So being able to approach teaching, for example, from a perspective of, I want to soften the emphasis on grades, or I want to have a discussion-based classroom as opposed to a lecture-based classroom. These are all decisions that a teacher can make. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, as standardization has become sort of the norm in especially K-12 and even now in higher ed, those sorts of choices are left out of the hands of teachers. They actually can't make those choices anymore if they're going to meet standards and then continue to be paid. The pressure on them is to basically say, there's no room for my pedagogy anymore. I just have to do this thing in order to get these students through these tests.
Right.
And so we're handing over pedagogy to people who don't teach and who don't really understand school and who are more interested in turning out students who will be good employees and workers, as opposed to students who might be thinkers or creative people or problem solvers.
Which is what our society really needs right now. Like that's society we're moving
Right.
towards. Like, I don't know if you know who Peter
Right.
Drucker is, but we're basically now in a knowledge working society, which is you need creative problem solving, creative thinking. And if you don't have those things, like you can't survive in the society.
I was just finding some data about the Denver
Right.
public school system strike since I brought it up a second ago. And based on this data from October of 2018, Colorado is the 34th highest paying state for public educators in the country. And it has, at the same time, has the 11th highest cost of living average. So essentially, we see that where Colorado is in the top about 20% of cost of living, but then it's nearing the bottom 20% in salaries for its public school teachers.
God, it's terrible.
Right. Well, and that's part of the thing we were talking about before, about it being an ecosystem. We not only are our teachers not paid well, but we also aren't paying attention to the fact that it's incredibly expensive to live in Denver, and so they may be paid on a national basis, sort of similar to other teachers, but they're not being paid according to where they live and where they're being expected to live. The living conditions of teachers are not really paid attention to at all, I don't think.
Not in the slightest. So how might we be able to create this sense of value towards them, to be like, hey, these people that are guiding our youth to gain knowledge that is so valuable, how can we create a society that allows our people to value them more and make sure that they're paid what they're worth, which I believe personally is they should be the ones making multi-millions of dollars. Like, I don't know if you've seen the Key and Peele episode on that, but it's hilarious where they're like, there's teacher center and they're playing they're like ads for the teachers, and they go in and they're like, oh, Billy, look what she did there. She got Billy to speak when he didn't raise his hand, but she knew he's engaged. And it's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I've often wondered. There's no reality TV around teaching.
Well, and also when there is, it plays into a very, very narrow narrative about what teaching is, what teaching looks like. I think that one of the problems is that across when we look at colleges and universities, which is where we prepare a lot of people for the work that they're going to do in the world, teaching is seen as an instrumentalist task that people do. That's even true. It's certainly true among higher education teachers who are taught expertise in a particular field, but over half of them never have any experience or any preparation for being in the classroom. And they're just thrown into their first jobs and thrown into a classroom with no preparation whatsoever. And so that's definitely recognizing that expertise, knowledge, skills within a discipline are what's important, and that teaching is not itself seen as a discipline or seen as an area of research or seen as an area of craft. But I also think that that's true in K through 12, where schools of education are often seen as sort of career readiness, spaces for career readiness, getting people ready to be in the classroom, rather than creating experts, artists in the work of teaching. And the thing is, if we look across other fields that are honored, that are recognized as having value, what we see are a sort of art, either an artisanship or we see a recognition and an acknowledgement of expertise as being valuable, or we see something like skill and mastery as being super important. At this point, what we're trying to do is get people basic level training, remedial level training and teaching, so that they meet particular state standards so that they can be thrown into the classroom as quickly as possible. And so we've got a kind of a snake eating its tail problem, that the fact that we undervalue and don't pay teaching well, and that we don't recognize it as an art or as an area of expertise, means that we have less people interested in becoming teachers, which means that we have to allow people to be teachers without any expertise or training whatsoever, just to meet the demand of the classroom. And so there's a sort of an endless cycle here. That how do we break it? Well, we break it by recognizing and honoring teaching as an art. As an art form that involves both natural ability in some cases, but also skill and craft and expertise. I get fired up about that one.
Yeah. I like it, man. I agree with all of that. I think that, in terms of just making change in this way, I mean, that the question, I'm glad Jesse had an answer to it, because honestly, it's a stumper for me, because if there was a way toward it, I would hope that we were doing it in some way. And what I see increasingly is less and less valuing of teachers from when I was a child, and felt like there was more support for teachers. I mean, I was a kid, so I don't really know, to now when they're considered civil servants. I mean, they're people that should do what we want them to do when we send our kids to their schools, and there's really there's not a sense of them having what Jesse's talking about, a craft, and how you get to that, I'm not really sure. You put more teachers on Ellen, and you put more teachers on you show them, you show what work they're doing, and you stop valuing folks who are not butts. Good examples of education.
No, exactly. I think have you guys watched The School of Life at all? Do you know that YouTube channel?
No.
It's a really phenomenal YouTube channel. It's all about philosophy and building better relationships and whatnot. But one of the points I really like that he made in there is to a similar regard that you're talking about, Sean, is where we shouldn't put up, even really like business moguls or, actors and things of that nature on the news and, hold them to this super high regard. We should hold like the average person that, is like a gardener, and like be like, hey, look how good this guy did at just gardening these plants. Like, he's an amazing guy. Or, look at that teacher that is just helped that kid get, work through this really tough time in their lives and figure this hard problem out that they were having trouble with, and then they solved it. Like, that's how I think people should be highlighted. And then you can see that being, average or ordinary, in essence, can be extraordinary.
Well, and also, I guess the one thing I want to say, which kind of connects to this and kind of links back to my previous point, is that when we talk about the systemic devaluing of teachers, one of the things that I don't want to do is seem to suggest that I devalue the actual teachers who are working within this really complicated system. When I point to the system that I see as devaluing teaching and devaluing the work and credentialing teachers in a way that reduces them to just cogs, I don't mean to point to the people doing this work and say that they are, I think that we're all contributing to the system in the way that structures work. But I also think that there are so many unbelievably great teachers who continue working in spite of all of the things that I'm describing. I think of these Denver public school teachers who are striking. Why are they striking? They're striking because they want to continue doing the work, because the work means something to them. And they don't want their work so devalued that that they can't do it anymore. And so walking out for them is not about leaving the work. It is about doing the work, putting their lives on the line for their work. And I think that there are so many teachers who are doing that every day. And Sean and I end up working with a lot of those teachers who, in the spite of this system that we see devaluing our work, we nonetheless continue to somehow be teachers and to wake up every morning. And again, I'm going to be a teacher today. There's been a lot of days when I woke up and said, maybe I should be a real estate agent. I could make some money if I was a real estate agent. But at the end of all those days, I was still a teacher.
Yeah, because it's about that purpose. It's about that feeling of that you're really contributing to the world in some meaningful way. And I think that is one of probably the best way to do it is to teach another something like that. But we can't let these people be miserable in their lives in the day to day and be stressed and because they're passing on that stress right to the kids. We need to let them thrive and really enjoy what they're doing. And I think that's important in creating the society is allowing for that and allowing for them to really put everything they can. Because if they're not stressing about, paying that bill, whether that's taking them away from being present with those kids in the moment, if they could do that, imagine the impact that could have. Now that could even 10x, even in the system we have, potentially make it better. But in
I think
the
same
system,
way that we're talking about with our island metaphor, this idea, if you teach kids from very early on to be teachers, then they'll value the work of teaching and also start contributing to it as early as possible. I think it also trickles down the other way. So if we think about national government, then state government, and then we think about school boards, and then we think about what's happening at college and how that trickles down. If most people are being trained to be teachers in the K through 12 system within college, then we've got to solve the things that are going on in college, because the things that happen to college students when they're learning to be teachers, when they're getting their teacher's certification, ends up trickling down to kids. And I think that we all sort of take that back and forth with us into our home lives, so that there's a sense in which there is only a few degrees of separation from decisions made at the national level about funding for public education that end up directly impacting who I am and who I can be at home. And there's only a few levels of remove from that. So ultimately, I think another problem is that how often do K through 12 teachers and higher education teachers sit down and talk through the problem of public education in the United States and the devaluing of public education in the United States? Instead, what I hear more often is I hear them talking about one another in almost with scripts that are given to us from the media or given to us from our government that, again, allows us to sort of fight within. I hear it so much from college teachers. Well, gosh, the K through 12 system is sending us blah, 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 blah kinds of students. And I just think, when was the last time you actually just sat and talked to a K through 12 teacher? I don't think anybody's sending us anything. I think that this is a problem that we can only deal with if we all work through it together.
Man, without a doubt. That's what it's going to take. We all gotta band together and figure this one out. It's an important one, I think. Yep. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Sean?
I guess, I just keep coming back to this idea of the whole sort of ecosystem piece of it. And Jesse and I do a lot of work in a field called critical pedagogy, which was started by a labor organizer and teacher in Brazil, Paulo Freire, many, many years ago. And it's like what Jesse's talking about, basically that education, what education becomes is so intricately woven into our home lives and how we think about education, how we think about ourselves, how we think about our kids or our parents, and there's so many interesting social dialogues that go on. Jesse talked about the sort of almost sort of competitive nature between who's doing a worse job, higher ed or K-12. And instead of working together, and the same kind of thing happens in K-12, where you have teachers versus parents, or you have teachers versus administrators versus parents, and students are in there somewhere trying to get an education, within this framework of critical pedagogy that I mentioned, sort of one of the main components is being able to look very critically at what's really going on. Paulo Freire talked about reading your world, being able to read what's actually happening in your world, and helping students or helping parents or helping teachers or helping administrators or helping anybody who's involved in the education system begin to look at what's really happening, to be able to look past these frameworks or these dialogues that were handed by history or by our former teachers or by the government or whomever, by the popular media, social media, all these different places where we get these messages. If we can look past those and sort of see, okay, well, why are these messages being taught? Why are these messages being broadcast? And then why am I accepting them for what they are? It's not unlike the sort of conversation that Jesse was having earlier about well, these walls are made of brick, and so I can't really do anything about it. Well, why are the walls made of brick? What can we do about it? Are there windows? Can you open the windows? Can we go outside? Or do we need to smash it down in order to change things? Actually, really asking those sorts of critical questions, starting from the very beginning, starting from when you're a new parent and looking at your kid and like, okay,
yes,
am I going to parent the way I was parented? How was I parented? I mean, you have to ask these sorts of questions. There's sort of this sort of constant awareness of why you act the way you act, why you talk the way you talk, why you have the opinions that you have. And it doesn't mean that your opinions are necessarily wrong. It just means that you have to be able to inspect them and then make choices based on what's really going on. And I think that's a really important piece of it. So much of critical pedagogy comes. The movement is sort of very much a grassroots movement. And so I feel like changing education is not something that's going to start is not necessarily going to start with policymakers. It's probably going to start with teachers, or it's going to start with parents, or it's going to start with the students. But we have to give them the room to grow into that. We have to give them a chance for different dialogues, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. So how do you think we do that? How do we allow for critical pedagogy and critical thinking? How do we formulate the classroom to help grow that and help make that the pinnacle, the center of the classroom? Because, one thing too, like you were saying, I loved what you said about being able to read the world. I feel like we do a really poor job of that currently because we're not teaching really what kind of essential to humanists in our society, which I think one of the main classes that needs to be taught is communication. How do you really effectively communicate with another person? Because whatever you're doing, you have to do that. And two, like financial literacy, living in the world and the society we've constructed. And then like relationships, which is tied to communication, but, like romantic relationships, and how do you navigate one of those? So what do you think about how do we create this critical thinking system?
Well, I mean, I think part of it comes from giving. I think part of it comes from giving teachers the room to actually control their own pedagogy again. So that's taken out of the hands of policymakers and given back to teachers so that they have the opportunity to figure out how they want to make change in their own individual classrooms. And then I think, there's a really broad, wide societal trend toward not critical thinking, and really accepting whatever's given and shutting ourselves down. And some of that comes from social media, some of it comes from reality TV, some of it comes from others, our broadcast news. I mean, there's a lot of just accepting the messages that we're given, and I think that starts in education and ends in education. But honestly, other than giving teachers the space to really start doing this, because teachers, generally speaking, my belief is anyway, that teachers get into the work because they are themselves critical thinkers, and they are themselves compassionate critical thinkers. They want to bring, at least K-12 teachers want to bring students up into a world where they can have some agency, where they can make some change if that's what they want to do. But they're not given the opportunity to bring those students into that.
Well, and I do
so much is being
work
controlled
and
from
research
outside.
on student shaming and the sort of culture that we've created that causes teachers and sometimes administrators to say really what I would say are hateful things about students, judgmental, things about students. And to echo what Sean said, I don't think that anyone starts the work of teaching from a place of so cruelly misjudging students or so cruelly judging students. I think instead what happens is that the life of the work, the heartbeat of the work gets sort of suffocated out of it for them so that they can't, so that they essentially don't know how to engage the work anymore. And so oftentimes when I push back on student shaming, I really also have to say that when I push back on student shaming, my goal is not to shame teachers for student shaming. My goal is to point to the system that we've created that devalues teaching, devalues the work of teaching, and also devalues students, underestimates students, patronizes students. And I think one of the ways that we do that is through the kind of standardization that Sean is talking about. To standardize a curriculum is to assume that every student is the same, which is to misrecognize the amazing complexity of students, and also to imagine that every student is the same white privileged kid who those curriculums are often written for. Instead, we have to imagine curriculums that are flexible, that grow and shape and shift in order to actually meet the real students that show up to our classrooms. The same thing for teachers. We can have best practices. We can have set curriculums. Different teachers will create different inputs into that system. So even if we have a set curriculum that is nice and flexible and built for this hyper-contextual student, this really rich, complicated student that I'm trying to describe, every teacher is going to bring something different to the conversation. And so we also have to recognize that the work of teaching is as idiosyncratic as the work of learning. Every student brings a context. They bring a social background. They bring their race, their gender, their sexuality to the classroom, but also every teacher does as well. And so we have to recognize that we can't build set curriculums for students or for teachers because the biggest variable is the specific teacher that shows up to the room and the specific students that are in that room.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, everyone's just so different that everyone needs something different to learn. Like everyone's got a different way that they learn, right? Like some people are auditory learners, some people are visual learners. Everyone has their different way of consuming information that works best for them. And everyone has different interests too. Like I was talking with my friend the other day who's a teacher, and he was just talking about how he's so frustrated with this one student who just like won't listen, who's like falling asleep. And I'm just like, I started talking to him and like drilling in and being like, what's going on here? Like, what's going on with this student? And, he's having, he says he's got a single mother. He's, not interested in, doing schoolwork because it obviously probably doesn't seem interesting to him, but he loves playing video games. Like he stays up late playing video games. So I started getting into that, like, well, how do you incentivize him and make learning fun for him by maybe finding a way to use video games? Like we got to be able to gear the curriculum in the class to what interests the student. I'm trying to remember this. One of my favorite quotes. You got to teach, dang it, it's not going to come to me, but it has something to do with like the particular bent of the student. You can't judge a student by the way like the grass blows. You got to let it. I
totally grasp what you're talking about. And the other thing I would add to that is that when I talk about the complexity and the differences between students, which this idea that we have to be able to meet each student where they are, I think sometimes when we think about specific learning styles like auditory learner or visual learner, we also have to recognize that every student is different on every given day, at every given moment, with every different with every different subject. So I might be able to study film best from a visual perspective where I pause on particular frames and talk about the geometry of the frame, but I might actually learn math better in my brain. I might do math in my head. And so the idea is that what we have to recognize is that students are crazily different from one another. And they have a ton of complexity and difference within themselves. So sure, give me a video game one day, but if you give me a video game every single day, even if I'm a lover of video games, at a certain point, that's going to stop working. And so what we have to do is recognize and engage students in all of the different ways that they can be engaged. And so it's like create this sort of extraordinarily visceral classroom where we're having new experiences and different experiences every time we walk into it. And then we're talking to each other about those experiences. Oh, this worked for me. Oh, it didn't work for me last time, but today it really did. And so sort of getting to work through and process what's happening. So I do a lot of work on metacognition, and I talk to students, and I have students do a lot of self-evaluation. So metacognition, thinking about our own thinking. And I do this in front of students so that when I'm teaching, I sometimes will stop midst activity or midst lecture or midst whatever it is that I'm doing that day. And then I'll just suddenly talk about why I chose to do it. And I'll ask students questions about it. Like I'll say, gosh, I don't actually know why I had us read that article today. It seemed right, but I'm not sure. Was it? And then I have students sort of getting into the head of the classroom, and then having them do that same thing with their own learning. Having them ask questions, to just stop midst whatever we're doing and say, how is this working for you? What's working about it? What's not working about it? Why do you think that is? So that kind of meta reflection, I think, is really important when we're learning, so that we're not just learning without also thinking about our own learning as we're doing it.
Oh man, you're speaking my language there. Questions, man. That's the answer.
I think that, and I think that actually, I mean, that folds really nicely in with the whole idea of critical pedagogy, because it requires a sort of metacognitive stance to be able to look at yourself and how you think and how you perceive and how you behave. Similarly, I think it's important it's as important to recognize the complexity of students as it is to recognize the complexity of teachers. There may be teachers who can pull off certain kinds of things in class, and there may be students and there may be teachers who really can't, and that may be because they are women of color, or they're coming from a different background where they have a different kind of schooling in their background, or they're coming from a place where an adjunct teacher who's sleeping in their car, and they're not going to be able to pull off a lot of the same kinds of things. But if you still have that critical thinking piece, if you still have that critical pedagogy piece, even about yourself, and the metacognitive piece about yourself, you can figure out, what can I do? And what can I do to make my job more satisfying? What can I do to make my students more, help my students find their agency in more ways? And so it's we have to be very careful about anything that says this is how learning happens, or these are different learning styles, or this is the right pedagogy, or these are the best practices. We have to be really careful about that, because it's never going to apply in every single situation. And trying to make it apply in every single situation is going to lead to failure at some point. And that failure may get masked by, the way we mask it now, by having people achieve certain standards and saying, well, they achieved this. They passed this test. Now they know. But that failure is still happening. If we're not able to figure out how to be critical of our own teaching, and critical of our own sort of environment and our own capacity within the classroom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, without a doubt. I loved it, man. So any last thoughts on anything you'd like to add before we kind of wrap it up and I ask the last question here?
I don't think so. I'm ready.
Not for me.
Okay.
I mean, there's so much talk
to be
about
honest,
this.
No, I think we can stay here all
forever.
day. In fact, where's that island that you started this with?
Easily. I usually say it's off the coast of Fiji somewhere.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That's good. That'll work.
Somewhere warm, ideally. I like warm weather. But yeah, man, it's been great. I really appreciate you guys coming on, and you guys had some really amazing insights, honestly. So, the way I kind of wrap it up is, what can people do to help you out, and where can they find both you on the internet?
I'll start by saying that we've, over the last, so a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today, Sean and I have been talking about for, it depends on how you count, for 2 years, 7 years, or 18 years. We've both been teaching for right around 18, 19 years. And 7 years ago, we started working on a project together that neither of us realized at first that we were working on. And then I dropped it on Sean that in fact we were working on it, that the entire time we were secretly writing a book. And so we were writing stuff on our own blogs. We were writing stuff across the web. We were writing stuff on the journal that we've both had a hand in running, Hybrid Pedagogy. And about 2.5, 3 years ago, I said to Sean, hey, you know what? This whole time we've actually been writing a book. And so now we're going to spend the next 2 years assembling this, writing some new stuff, and go carefully crafting it and editing it into a volume. And we kept that secret from everybody for those 2 years, partly because that weird pressure that you get when you tell people you're working on a book, that they're then asking, how's the book coming? How's the book coming? So we kept it secret actually until the week that the book came out. So we've got a book called The Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy. And it's about so many of the different topics that we're talking about here. And it's really an everything but the kitchen sink kind of book. It's set up as about 45, between 45 and 50 short chapters. And each one is on a slightly different topic, sort of working around this conversation from all possible angles.
Awesome. So definitely everyone needs to check out the book.
That is available online, actually, both for purchase, but also it's open access, so people can get it for free and read it without having
it's
to pay for
available
it
via Kindle. And then also, if you just go to urgencyofteachers.com, it's the open access version is there.
Awesome. And then what about, we met on Twitter, which is awesome. I'm really getting into Twitter now. I think it's an amazing resource. I didn't realize what it could do until...
truthfully, the Twitter community around teaching and learning is really an extraordinary community. And even though in recent years I've started to raise my eyebrow at Twitter a little bit in various different ways, because it's a giant corporation and and it's free, and so you have to wonder, what are they doing with our data? Nonetheless, I think it's still an important community that we have to populate, and a place where lots of cool conversations about teaching and learning are happening. My Twitter handle is @Jessifer, and Sean's is.
I'm at Slam Teacher, and we both have websites. Mine's
truthfully, come say hello to me on Twitter. I actually try and crazily, I read every single one of my notifications, and I at least try and like every single person that ever says something, because I'm this kind of person who, like, if someone talks to me, I sort of feel like at the very least I have to make eye contact, even if some days I have too many notifications to be able to respond to them all.